Last week, we sent a questionnaire to every Republican presidential candidate, announced and potential, asking about Ukraine. We posed 6 questions. Is opposing Russia in Ukraine a vital strategic interest for America? What's our objective in Ukraine, and how are we going to know when we've achieved it? What is the limit of money and weapons you'd be willing to send to Zelensky? Have U.S. sanctions been effective? And does the United States face the risk of nuclear war with Russia? It's kind of presumptuous for a cable show to send these, but no one else in the media seemed to be asking them, and we thought we should. The first presidential primaries are 10 months away. Voters should know where their candidates stand on the big issues, and this in some ways is the biggest issue. So tonight we're happy to report that virtually everyone we asked responded. Nikki Haley ignored us. John Bolton said he was too busy doing some unspecified thing. But most of the rest of them did get back to us, and we are grateful that they did. In general, the answers were fascinating. Some of them were so thoughtful and so smart, they give you hope for the Republican Party. With only a few exceptions, their answers bore no resemblance at all to the statements you see every day from Mitch McConnell and various Republican committee chairmen in the Congress. Republicans in Washington tend to be committed neocons in the Hillary Clinton mold. But Republicans running for president this cycle generally are not at all. That was a surprise, a refreshing surprise. We had no idea. We didn't know what to think. So we're going to post every response that we got in full on our Twitter account tonight as a public record of where the candidates stand on Ukraine. We hope you will look at them. But first, here's a quick summary of what we received. So former President Donald Trump, who as of tonight is the front runner for the Republican nomination, sent a long and really interesting response. Russia would never have attacked Ukraine if I were president, he writes, not even a small chance. Trump says he opposes regime change in Russia. Quote, we should support regime change in the United States. That's far more important. The Biden administration are the ones who got us into this mess. Trump repeatedly refers to the risk of nuclear war, which he describes as absolutely real, and then he calls for a negotiated peace by Ukraine mediated by the United States. Quote, both sides are weary and ready to make a deal, Trump writes. The meeting should start immediately. There is no time to spare. Death and destruction must end now. Trump has been saying things like this and predicting this for 5 years now, and he's saying it again. What's interesting, though, is that Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence, who was also running for president this year, opposes his old boss on nearly every point. We're paying the Ukrainians to fight Russia, Pence writes, so we won't have to fight Russians ourselves. Pence endorses even stricter sanctions against Moscow. He dismisses the risk of nuclear war as a, quote, bullying tactic from Putin. And then Pence suggests that anyone who disagrees with his views on Ukraine is a disloyal American. Quote, there is no room for Putin apologists in the Republican Party. Mike Pence did not specify who he was talking about, though we suspect this show is included in that treasonous category. And then maybe the most newsworthy response that we received was from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis has well-known views on many topics, of course, but until tonight, no one could really say with precision where he stood on the war in Ukraine, which is arguably the most important topic in the world. And now we know. DeSantis is adamantly opposed to the position that most Republicans in Washington have taken on Ukraine. DeSantis is not a neocon. Who knew? Quote, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, DeSantis writes, securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Without question, he writes, peace should be the objective. The U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders. F-16s and long-range missiles should therefore be off the table. These moves would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's 2 largest nuclear powers. That risk is unacceptable. DeSantis goes on to oppose the policy of regime change in Moscow, which is very popular in Washington, and he points out that the Biden administration has created an alliance between Russia and China, and that's a disaster for the United States. Quote, we cannot prioritize intervention in an escalating foreign war over the defense of our own homeland, especially as tens of thousands of Americans are dying every year from narcotics smuggled across our open border, and our weapons arsenals, critically for our own security, are rapidly being depleted. So that's DeSantis' position, clarified. Vivek Ramaswamy, meanwhile, who you just saw, who announced for president on this show a few weeks back, responded with what was effectively an essay. It was so tightly argued and sharp, it probably should be a Wall Street Journal piece. We hope it becomes one. We can't really do it justice here, but a few short excerpts give you the flavor. Quote, China wants the Ukraine war to last as long as possible to deplete Western military capacity before invading Taiwan. It's working. We think we appear stronger by helping Ukraine, but actually become weaker vis-a-vis China. We've spent 20 years droning people in caves in the Middle East and Central Asia and have little to show for it. We should be taking out the people who have caused the deaths of more than 100,000 Americans every year, the Mexican drug cartels. If I were president right now, I would limit any further funding or support to Ukraine. Ukraine is not in the top 5 of American foreign policy priorities right now, and yet merely questioning whether the money we spent on the war is being done effectively or perhaps even prolonging the war is seen as disloyal. We get accused by both Democrats and Republicans of being, quote, Putin sympathizers. The Washington Uniparty and defense contractors want this conflict to go on forever. For the sake of the global economy and peace, we should be doing everything we can to end it tomorrow. End quote. Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota echoed some of these points. The primary external threat to the United States is communist China, she writes. And then she added another point that you rarely hear and not often enough. Quote, the United States has come to rely far too heavily on financial sanctions as a weapon of deterrence. Now the nations that hate America are consciously moving away from the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Sanctions against China, Iran, and Russia have bolstered the Russian ruble and enabled China to establish trade in Chinese money rather than in U.S. dollars. That is true, provably true. And you wonder why so few in Congress, which passed these sanctions, will acknowledge it. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, meanwhile, was not quite so bold or precise, but in spirit, he seemed to agree with most of the rest of the Republican candidates. Quote, President Biden's blank check foreign policy in Ukraine has diverted funding from essential needs in the United States. Throwing money at Ukraine with no accountability or objective is clearly failing. End quote. Once again, we had no idea the candidates felt this way until today, and we're glad they do. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, by the way, did not send a statement, but instead a transcript from a hit he did on Trey Gowdy's weekend show here on Fox. Not many details in it, but Scott did call for, quote, degrading the Russian military. He did not explain what the point of that might be. And finally, Chris Christie is still around and still full of bombast, still a sporty character. In fact, if anything, Christie seems to become even more orthodox as a neocon. He calls on the U.S. military to fight and win a war against both Russia and China simultaneously. Otherwise, he warns, Iran and North Korea could take over the world. So that is where the Republican presidential candidates stand on Ukraine. But do not take our word for it. We are posting their answers unedited on Twitter right now. We hope you will take a look. We hope you will read them. They're interesting, whether you agree or disagree. And once again, thank you to everyone who took the time to respond in such a thoughtful way. Almost all did, and we're grateful for that. Subscribe to the Fox News YouTube channel to catch our nightly opens, stories that are changing the world and changing your life. From Tucker Carlson tonight.